As we've discussed in this course, a lot has changed with model interconnection procedures since the first adoption of the NARUC model back in 2003. Since the model interconnection procedures from the Interstate Renewable Energy Council are the most updated and the most authoritative at this point in time, what I've done is put together a summary document to help highlight some of the biggest changes to the model interconnection procedures since IREC's original model interconnection procedures in 2005. As we mentioned several times, between 2005 and 2023, IREC has updated its original model 4 times, and this spreadsheet helps to provide a high-level summary of those changes. Now, there are a few notes in here. I'm not going to read them verbatim, but a big thing to keep in mind is that this summary sheet is high level. It doesn't get down into the details. There are a lot of provisions that have seen substantive changes over the years, and not all of them are included here. What is included here are some of the provisions that if you go in to look at a state's current interconnection procedures will likely indicate where your state is in terms of being up to date or outdated. So why don't we go ahead and dig into this tool, and again, you can go ahead and play around with this by downloading it out of the course. The first thing here are just general provisions. There are a number of general provisions in IREC's model interconnection procedures. I highly recommend you get acclimated with the 2023 edition of the model interconnection procedures. As time goes on and as IREC updates the model interconnection procedures, you may see a 2026 edition, for instance, in this spreadsheet. I just haven't recorded the video again. In the earliest IREC model, they aggregated best practices from NARUC, from MADRI, from FERC, and put them into one document. And as such, they included a limitation of 10 megawatts for facilities that were covered under these rules. And some of that had to do with assumptions of which types of facilities would be FERC jurisdictional versus those that would be state jurisdictional. As you can see here, by the 2009 edition, the rule applicability applied to all state jurisdictional facilities, regardless of size. And then in 2019, IREC made sure that energy storage facilities were also included, since the terminology prior was quote unquote generating facilities, and energy storage isn't necessarily a generator. This helped to clarify that it was a type of technology that these rules were applicable for. Other key provisions are the inclusion of a supplemental review process. So as we'll see a little bit further down in this workbook, there are a couple of screening pathways. So these are pathways in which the utility doesn't do detailed engineering review. These are for smaller, lower impact projects, with the idea being similar to what was argued back when FERC was putting together its generator interconnection procedures, which is a 10 kW PV system doesn't need to go through the same types of studies as these multi-megawatt facilities. So what are the checks that we can have to make sure that it's not going to impact the grid without having to go through those engineering studies? So there are 2 review pathways, a simplified process and a fast track process, that utilize screens rather than engineering studies and tend to be conservative in order to be able to expedite review. A supplemental review process was introduced in 2013, which said, okay, we recognize the simplified review and the fast track review are conservative. We should have something that studies the project but isn't a full-blown system impact study if we can avoid it. And so the supplemental review process was introduced in 2013. And the supplemental review process is also in the 2013 update to FERC's small generator interconnection procedures. The update of IEEE 1547 in 2018 was significant, as it really got into not just the anti-islanding aspects of inverters. Anti-islanding means that when the grid goes down, the inverter will shut off so that it doesn't itself maintain voltage on the grid, which could cause safety and reliability issues. The 2018 version of the IEEE 1547 standard brought in a lot of the grid support functionality that inverters can create, which means the ability to ride through higher low voltage events without dropping off and thus potentially exacerbating that issue, and to provide other types of voltage regulation that can be beneficial to the grid at large. And so that was passed in 2018. In the 2023 version of the Model Interconnection Procedures, there are provisions related to how that standard can be adopted to best maximize both the benefits of that standard and to use the nuances of that standard to facilitate larger amounts of DERs being able to interconnect to the grid. Also in 2023, there was a big change in terms of export limitation methods. The Model Interconnection Procedures used to have 4 levels of review. Level 1 was the simplified process that was for largely residential and small commercial projects. Level 2, which could range up to 5 megawatt facilities, but this is largely your medium to larger commercial projects, small to medium-sized community solar projects. And that level 2 process was really a screening process that didn't get into deep engineering review. Therefore, not all projects of that size might qualify. You may see a project, for instance, that was 500 kW that failed the level 2 screens and would need to proceed to a level 4, which is a detailed study process, in order to see what types of upgrades would be needed in order for that project to be able to interconnect and whether that would be feasible for the project to be able to incur those additional costs. You've heard me mention level 1, level 2, level 4. There was a level 3 review for non-exporting facilities that dates back to the original IREC model. Back in those days, non-exporting facilities largely were projects where the size of the actual generation facility was smaller than the minimum load of the facility itself. So think about a small, let's say 50 kilowatt system that was atop a large manufacturing plant. That project's never going to backfeed to the grid, and therefore there were provisions that were in there related to how to review those projects. Over time, things have become more sophisticated. And now when we think about non-exporting facilities, it may be that the project is quite big compared to load. And what the system owner is trying to do is to make sure they're addressing grid constraints by not exporting electricity to the grid at the time when the production from the system might exceed the load in the facility. Similarly, we see an increase in the use of limited export, and that's to deal with specific constraints on the grid. A lot of these review processes are looking at just the worst handful of hours over the course of the year. And so if the DER can limit its export to whatever the maximum is that the grid can handle at that time for the period of time where there's a constraint, and then there is the potential to put more and more capacity on the grid and just make sure that it's responsive to the needs of the grid. So in the 2023 IREC Model Interconnection Procedures, the level 3 review process was eliminated and provisions were included to specify what types of export limitations were permissible for ensuring that the DER doesn't inadvertently export too much power to the grid when it could create issues on the grid. And therefore, now those projects that normally would have been under that level 3 process may end up falling into a level 1, which is now just the simplified process, the level 2, which is now the fast track process, or the detailed study process, which used to be level 4. Additionally, there were details related to data transparency that have changed over the years. Pre-application reports here in column G are used by folks who are developing projects to understand what the constraints on the grid might be prior to putting in an application. There's a bunch of costs putting in an application. You have to do engineering, and you want to make sure that before you go through that process, it's actually worth doing. Pre-application reports did not exist until the 2013 Model Interconnection Procedures from IREC, and they have existed since. Additional transparency from the utility comes in the form of utility reporting. These are usually annual or biannual reports that the regulator will require the utility to provide. There were none of these in the original Model Interconnection Procedures. In 2009 and 2013, there were provisions that required the utility to report just on the number and size of projects that had been interconnected during the year. And in 2019, this went through a major overhaul in which details are now required of utilities on various steps in the processes so that the regulator is able to see where the utility is doing well and where the utility is starting to see bottlenecks. And a lot of this has to do with timeline compliance. Lastly, our dispute resolution provisions. The 2005 model had some really light dispute resolution language, and it largely said, hey, if you have something that comes up with interconnection, you should bring this quote unquote technical master in. And they referred to like the Department of Energy or folks along those lines that had expertise in interconnection. Over time, these changed. In 2009. They got rid of the technical master and moved towards an informal resolution process that encouraged the parties, which are typically an interconnecting customer and the utility, to have a discussion about the challenges that are going on and try and resolve it before it goes through the state's formal complaint process, which can be pretty arduous and resource intensive. But in those initial informal resolution processes, there were no timelines in terms of how long it should take for the utility to respond and for the complainant to respond to the utility. That didn't happen until the 2019 Model Interconnection Procedures. And this evolution of dispute resolution really highlights that a lot of the issues that pop up with interconnection disputes are more procedural and less technical. There is a technical aspect to many of them, but a lot of this is about rule compliance, and a lot of it has to do with, is the customer being treated fairly under the rules that are on the books? The 2023 Model Interconnection Procedures injected a further level to this to help streamline this process, which is having a designated interconnection ombudsperson at the regulator to be able to manage these disputes and usher them through the various steps that are outlined in the Model Interconnection Procedures. All right, let's go down to the review processes I mentioned before. So simplified review, as I mentioned prior, used to be called Level 1 and is largely for residential and small commercial projects. Early on in the 2005 edition, these projects were limited to a nameplate rating of 10 kilowatts or less. A really big change over time, as you can see here, was in 2009, moving this up to 25 kilowatt projects. And this is again on the nameplate rating. And then in 2023, allowing for a 25 kilowatt limit that is the export limit, and allowing a nameplate of up to 50 kilowatts. So this means you could have, say, 50 kilowatt solar PV system that only exports 25 kW, or more likely a 50 kW combined solar and storage project that only exports 25 kilowatts to the grid. This change is important because the simplified review, as the name indicates, is the most streamlined process. As you can see here, it's expected that the utility can complete these screens in 7 days at this point. In the first edition, it was 10 business days, and it has since been 7 business days. If you recognize that in 2009, the number of applications that were coming in for utilities were far less than they were in 2013, 2019, 2023. This 7 business days remaining the same indicates an expectation that the utilities are adapting processes from what back in the day was likely a pen and paper application to today an automated process through a platform that the utility uses to really streamline the paperwork that comes in and to make sure that it is processed in a way that minimizes the amount of time that the utility staff needs to review it. Another very significant change is the penetration screen. The penetration screen is a review of how much aggregate generation, so not just the project that's applying, but all of the other DERs on a specific circuit or line section of that circuit are there compared to the minimum load on that circuit. A fundamental consideration in interconnection review is this idea of minimum load and penetration. And it's a generally accepted concept that if the total generation on the circuit does not exceed the minimum load, then things related to voltage and islanding and all kinds of other safety and reliability issues are fine. It's once you start to have more generation on a specific part of a circuit or the circuit, then there is load. So essentially that energy is moving in the reverse direction from the way the system was originally designed from that line section or circuit. That's when things are expected to need to be evaluated in more depth to make sure that it isn't going to cause issues with equipment on the system. Now, as you can see here in 2005 through 2019, that penetration screen was 15% of the annual peak load. And that number doesn't come from the ether. In utility design, it's generally expected that the minimum load on a circuit is going to be approximately 30% of the maximum annual load. So the 15% is built on that utility standard, and it's just divided by 2 to provide a factor of safety of 2 for circuits that may not meet that exact relationship. If you have highly seasonal circuits, let's say in a summer resort town, you might see a high annual load in the middle of the summer for air conditioning and everything else that's going on in that community. But then in the wintertime, everybody's gone somewhere else. That 30% may not hold true. And so this factor of safety of 2, which created this 15% of annual peak load, helps accommodate those types of scenarios. The reason it was based on maximum peak load is that that is data that the utilities historically have measured for the purposes of planning. If a peak continues to go up and up, they may need to make upgrades on the grid to manage the increasing magnitude of power that's being delivered. These days, as we know, data is more plentiful and utilities measure minimum loads for other planning reasons. And so in the 2023 edition of IREC Model Interconnection Procedures, this screen was shifted from the more conservative 15% of annual peak load to annual minimum load. And this more precisely evaluates, is there going to be more DER capacity exporting on that circuit than there is load during those times of year when the load is low? And that's critical. And this is a screen that needs to be updated in states across the country as a result. And then lastly, the shared secondary screen started out in 2005 as limiting the nameplate capacity of a generator when that generator shares a transformer with another customer. So for instance, at my house, I live in a village here in Maine. The transformer that serves my house also serves 2 of my neighbors. And I have solar on my house. The export from my inverter is increasing voltage locally. If I only had a single transformer serving my house and that voltage was high, it would get rectified at the transformer before it gets converted to medium voltage out on the grid. But for my particular set of circumstances, because I have other neighbors that are on that circuit, that high voltage that I create on my secondary, the secondary conductors are the conductors on the low voltage side of the transformer. So, for my house, these are the aerial conductors from the power pole that come to the weatherhead on my house and then connect down to my electric meter. I could potentially, if my solar was exporting too much capacity, create voltage issues at my neighbor's house and potentially blow electronics in their house if my system's too high and pushing too high of voltages. The shared secondary screen helps to address that particular issue. And as you can see here, in 2005, 2009, 2013, it was just based on this flat 20 kVA threshold. In 2019, it changed, and there were a number of engineers, et cetera, that looked at this screen to evaluate, should this be updated to a different metric that actually measures this better? And again, this is an approximation. It's a screen. It's not an engineering analysis. And the decision was made instead to just have a threshold for the size of the DER that's interconnecting, to have it based on the transformer nameplate rating. So instead of it being a 20 essentially kilowatt limit on my inverter, I have a 25 kVA transformer. So if I multiply that by 65%, I get somewhere in the neighborhood of 16, 17 kilowatts. So that's what's being used as the metric to roughly evaluate whether I could potentially create voltage issues on my neighbor's at my neighbor's electrical service, and is a much closer approximation than just this flat 20 kVA threshold. As we move to fast track review, you'll see a lot of similar changes. The secondary screen applies to fast track or level 2 projects, the penetration screen as well. The time to process screens hasn't changed. These projects are a bit bigger. They can be, as you see here, under maximum eligible size, upwards of 5 megawatts based on current model interconnection procedures. And so the utility needs more time to do more detailed screening of these projects. And the fast track projects are subject to a couple of additional screens that the simplified projects do not need to go through. The big change that's specific to fast track review is this maximum eligible size. It used to just be a flat 2 megawatt nameplate rating. This doesn't mean that any project under this size is going to get approved. It just means that this is the first process that it goes through. If it fails the technical screens, it could then go to a supplemental review process. And then if it fails the screens in the supplemental review, it would then have the choice to go to a detailed study, or a level 4 study in the old terminology. In 2013, both IREC and FERC updated their eligibility for this screening process to be based not on a flat system capacity, but on where it's located on the grid and what are the characteristics of the grid in that location. And so in 2013, a tabular approach was introduced based on the proximity of the site to the substation and the line voltage at that location. And this means that projects may qualify if they're as large as 5 megawatts, or if they're on low voltage and far away from the substation, or that information's not known, it may be as low as 1 megawatt. The other clarification to see here is in 2023, like a lot of other eligibility requirements, this is based on export versus the nameplate capacity. And then finally, moving into the detailed study section of the model interconnection procedures, not a ton has changed. The detailed study really gets into a lot of engineering processes that are required. So it's largely focused on what exact studies are performed and how long does the utility have to complete those studies. There used to be a feasibility study in the model interconnection procedures, and a lot of state interconnection procedures still include this idea of a feasibility study. That ended in the model interconnection procedures in 2013, which was the same year the supplemental review was introduced. And the thought here is that these other screening processes in the level 2 review and the supplemental review take care of a lot of what was in the feasibility study. And therefore, if a project has made it to a detailed study, it just needs to go to a system impact study. And so we'll get into talking about the system impact study, or SIS, here in a second. But the feasibility study, you can see, no longer exists in the model interconnection procedures. In the 2005 edition, when it was included, there was no timeline that was expected the utilities to complete this. That changed in 2009 when a 20 business day timeline was put in as an expectation for the utilities, but it was a pretty soft timeline. It said 20 business days unless there are other projects that this could impact, and then there was no definition as a backstop on that. The same thing existed for the system impact study, which has always been in the model interconnection procedures. You can see here, it wasn't defined in 2005 in terms of timelines. In 2009 and 2013, there's one of those soft 40 business day timelines unless the utility needs more time because of certain factors. And then in 2019, they just became hard, fast timelines. The expectation is that the utility completes these in 40 business days. The facilities study is a study that gets completed after the system impact study. It may or may not need to be completed. And a facilities study may actually be performed for a project that goes through fast track review if that project is expected to require upgrades to the distribution system. So the facilities study is a review of the utilities facilities to see what's going to need to happen there. Will there need to be protection equipment that gets reconfigured? Will things need to be upsized, which include conductors, which include regulators, etc.? And so that's what the facilities study does. That too has been in the model interconnection procedures since 2005. What has changed is expectations on how long the utility has to complete it and how accurate the estimates need to be out of the facilities study. So you can see here, the time to complete this study was not defined in 2005, just like with the feasibility study and just like with the system impact study. And then a soft timeline came in here in 2009, just like with the other two. This one was 60 business days with the same caveat that if there were other projects that were impacted by this, the utility could have more time and there was no backstop. And then in 2019, again, a hard, fast timeline was put into place. In this case, it actually got reduced from 60 business days to 45 business days. And finally, the cost responsibility for the distribution upgrades identified in the facilities study have changed over the years and changed pretty early. In 2005, the expectation was that the utility would provide a good faith estimate for the cost of upgrades that was within 25% of the final cost. It didn't say that it had to be within 25%, it just was a good faith estimate. This is an area where DER customers have seen a lot of variance, where an estimate from the utility might come in at one price and the actual cost may be a magnitude larger. It's not just a percentage larger, but there have been cases I have seen in which the actual costs were 5 times the estimated cost. And that's really problematic when it happens at the end of a project, because you make cost decisions early on in the project, typically before you build the project. You want to know you want to have cost certainty. In 2009, the IREC Model Interconnection Procedures limited the obligation of the interconnecting customers to 125% of the estimate that's provided by the utilities. And that language remains today. One of the questions that comes up that isn't necessarily dealt with in the IREC Model Interconnection Procedures is who is it that is obligated to pay any costs above that 25%? Is it the utility shareholders, or will the utility just take that and rate base it, meaning have all of the other customers that are on the grid pay for its inability to estimate accurately what those costs would be? And as you can likely guess, there's a big fairness question and a big fairness debate there. Really, what you want to see happen is that the party responsible for the estimate, in this case being the utility, is also the one who is accountable for the accuracy of that estimate. So that's an overview of this summary sheet. Again, there are copies in the course of every single one of these model interconnection procedures. A really effective way to use this is to take a look at your state's interconnection procedures and see where some of these key requirements fall. For instance, if I go in and I take a look at this and the simplified review process still is based on a 10 kilowatt nameplate rating, boy, we've got some old rules, and it allows you to compare kind of what vintage interconnection rules you have in your state.